Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, does the Buddha want his followers to remain celibate?
That depends, hermit. Many think that the monks and nuns must remain celibate because it is an act of cutting off the roots of sexual desire. However, others believe that as long as they do not become slaves to their desires, they do not have to be totally celibate.
Of course, refraining from sexual indiscretion and misconduct makes sense. These are things that could cause harm to others. However, total celibacy, which prohibits marriage and child-rearing, seems even more extreme than what the Buddha himself did. He had a wife and a son before he left the palace.
Indeed, he did. I would agree that it seems to be a large commitment, but note that he also abstained from sexual activity entirely after he renounced, just like he encourages us all to do.
I suppose that is true. Perhaps it is not sexual activity that is the problem in this case, but rather it is succumbing to sensory indulgence and desire.
I agree.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing sex in Buddhism. How ought we understand sex in Buddhism? What is the meaning and significance of the doctrine prohibiting sexual indiscretion? How have understandings of this doctrine changed over time? We hope you enjoy, so let's get to it. How ought we understand the position of sex in Buddhism?
This is a topic that I wanted to bring up on the show for a few reasons. One reason is that there is an image of Buddhism as encouraging somber and serious monasticism and celibacy. But the reality is that the vast majority of Buddhists and the vast majority of East Asian Buddhist monastics in particular are actually all sexually active people. Another reason is that sex is a very important topic in discussions of religious doctrines. All over the world, LGBTQ+ people are persecuted, often violently, because of queerphobia within a religious context. That religious context may be entirely contrived with no reliable evidence in the doctrinal texts themselves, or it may be actually explicitly stated in authoritative doctrinal texts. In either case, rampant queerphobia among religious institutions and organizations around the world is directly representative of religious activity influencing sex in society. Buddhism absolutely is a religion, and like all religions everywhere, it puts forth a doctrine that tries to subsume the entirety of all human experience and activity into a system of doctrines. Sex is a part of human experience, and so Buddhism, though many may not imagine it so, absolutely engages with the issue of sex in the sutras. So let's discuss how. Obviously, in the first sermon, sensual pleasure is identified as a potential cause for desire, and desire is identified as the cause of dukkha. Obviously, sex falls under that category. The idea is that the sensory pleasure derived from sex could or would cause a person to crave it and then seek it with indiscretion. But the craving itself can never be satiated, and the result is dukkha, this state of unsatisfactoriness. Thus, in the early texts, the Buddha essentially says to avoid indulging in sensory pleasures because they cause desire and dukkha. He also says to try to remove cravings for sensory pleasures, and that is how you'll reach enlightenment. Specifically, the third moral precept out of the 10 moral precepts that we know of is to abstain from misuse of sexual relationships, with the implication that sex in excess, sex that is harmful to you or others, and sex that is sought out from a place of craving or addiction is morally wrong. Monks had to practice total celibacy, but laypeople could still marry and reproduce. Not all sex is viewed as wrong if you're a layperson, but it is if you're a monk, at least as far as the early teachings are concerned. All forms of sexual activity, including masturbation, are grounds for expulsion and disrobing from a Theravada monastery. So the early texts present a very simplistic, black and white view of things, but the Buddha's message becomes more nuanced over time. There's a principle in Buddhism which argues that dukkha is inversely proportional to spiritual advancement. That is, the further along one is on the path of enlightenment, the less dukkha in their day-to-day experience. Think about the mind like soil and dukkha or enlightenment like a seed. If the mind is fertile soil for desire to take root, it will grow into dukkha. However, if the mind is cultivated and treated, the roots of desire can be removed, and the roots of bodhicitta, or the mind that seeks enlightenment, are planted, then enlightenment is the fruit. While all this is happening, people continue to experience sensory pleasure and pain every day, but what takes root and grows depends on the state of their mind, the soil. So by this scheme, more enlightened people are less likely to be adversely affected by engaging in sexual intercourse. Consider the Buddha himself. Before he renounced and became the Buddha, he indulged sensually, even hedonistically, at the palace of his father, the Shakya king. However, since he had planted the roots of bodhicitta in past lives, they began to fruit during his life as Siddhartha Gautama. This led him to renounce and eventually reach enlightenment. In that case, sex was not really a huge hindrance for him, but it was only because he was within a decade of attaining Buddhahood, which was the culmination of uncountable past lives of practice, study, and exertion.
Would it be reasonable to speculate that the work done in these past lives is what led him out of the hedonism trap? That previously planted bodhicitta could be the factor that helped him realize sensual indulgence is ultimately a dead end, instead of the typical, this is awesome, let's do this forever reaction that most people get from indulgence.
That's exactly correct. Higher levels of understanding and advancement on the path of enlightenment not only result in benefits in the moment, such as knowing that sensory indulgence is a dead end and thus avoiding it whenever the opportunity arises, but also then preventing the opportunity for sensory indulgence from arising for you later in the future. This could be later in your own life or even in future reincarnations. Furthermore, it is argued that bodhicitta is not something people can come back from. If you arouse bodhicitta in yourself, you will have it right up until the moment you reach your final nirvana, no matter how many lives or rebirths that is. It can't be removed or undone. So the benefits to your life and your situation don't go away either. Moving on to later Buddhism's engagement with sex, in Mahayana texts like the Lotus Sutra and the Vimalakirti Sutra, sex and other sensory indulgences and passions are reimagined further. First of all, the role of the bodhisattva becomes ever more emphasized in these texts. The purpose of the bodhisattva practice is presented as saving those who are trapped and bound by desire and passion. That requires them to engage with desire and passion directly. Vimalakirti hangs out with sex workers and gamblers and alcoholics, but he's not ensnared by these sorts of diversions because he's a bodhisattva. He engages in those vices to save people who are ensnared by them. Furthermore, in the Lotus Sutra, although bodhisattvas are called upon to carefully guard their senses at all times, the distinction between the dukkha nature of everyday world and the enlightened nature of Buddhahood is collapsed. That is to say that the Lotus Sutra presents the everyday world differently than any other text up to that point. First and foremost, it presents the world as being pervaded by the Dharma. The rocks and the trees and the passions themselves all expound the Dharma for those who listen. Beings that are unwholesome and morally transgressive are only presenting themselves that way as a means of teaching and leading sentient beings. All beings everywhere have the potential for Buddhahood, and all beings everywhere have the potential to be hidden Buddhas or hidden bodhisattvas who have manifested in the world as a teaching tool or as a means of saving other sentient beings. This includes sex. Though it has the potential to ensnare us in desire and in dukkha, it is an opportunity to demonstrate the Dharma. To sum up, the Lotus Sutra presents us with the concept of defining the Dharma by negation and reaching enlightenment through unwholesome means. We can learn the Dharma by learning that indulgence is not the way to enlightenment, and we can reach enlightenment as a result of knowing that, even though indulgence itself is unwholesome and is thought of as dragging you off of the path in the earlier Buddhist texts. The final iteration of thought that we should discuss is that of the esoteric Buddhists. Esoteric Buddhism introduces concepts of relativity and inclusivity into the mix. We have discussed how esoteric Buddhism regards the entire universe and everything in it as part of Vairocana's body world text, and how this body world text has the characteristic of being universally enlightening. Sex is a part of that too, meaning that sex, like everything else, is elevated to the level of being not just potentially enlightening, like it is in the early Mahayana stuff, but definitely enlightening. Though we may imagine it as being potentially unwholesome or as being a potential catching point for people to get ensnared into passion and indulgence and dukkha, it actually only appears that way because we don't understand ourselves or the world in terms of their Buddhahood. If we were to understand those things in terms of Buddhahood, and the universal nature of the Dharma, we would see relativity. That which appears as pleasant to us will be painful to another, rendering sensory judgments pointless and unhelpful for understanding the world. Additionally, we would see inclusivity. If the Buddha's compassion truly is universal, if the Dharma truly extends to everyone, if we really are all components of Vairocana's body-world text and Buddha-like manifestations of him, then how could we say that those who have sex are less morally good than those who are completely celibate? In this regard, desire, or the potentiality of desire taking root, are not what is important. Instead, morality becomes much more utilitarian. Moral good is doing the best for the most, and moral bad is doing anything less. Sex and what constitutes misconduct or moral transgression becomes contextually defined. For example, like I said earlier, if sex harms oneself or others, it is bad. However, indulging or not indulging does not matter as long as nobody is being harmed. Having a lot of sex, very little, or none at all, or masturbating or not, these are not immoral things as long as consent is respected and as long as there is no harm caused in the form of addictions, abuses, or anything like that.
What is the meaning and significance of the doctrine prohibiting sexual indiscretion?
This doctrine is significant due in part to the fact that some monastics have to observe celibacy while other monastics and lay people don't. But it is also significant due to the fact that this doctrine has been a catching point between the government, Buddhist ecumenical structures, and societies at large at various times in history. For example, we have spoken about how in Japan in the 1870s and 1880s, the Meiji government forced Japanese Buddhist monks back into lay society with direct laws and persecutions, but also with laws having to do with allowing monks to marry and eat meat again. That is a case where the government, in its increasingly anti-Buddhist policy position, legislated on the precept of celibacy for monks and nuns directly, with a clear and obvious goal of undermining the societal and political influence of the doctrine, the ecumenical structure, and the lay people who those institutions served and represented. Additionally, it is significant for understanding how Buddhists feel about LGBTQ+ people. There's a bit of ambiguity with regards to how Buddhism approaches LGBTQ+ issues. The precept about sex prescribes that people abstain from sexual misconduct, transgression, indiscretion, misuse, abuse, etc. It does not directly in itself define whether or not same-sex relationships are transgressive. That has left a lot of room for homophobes and queerphobes to say, because I believe these types of sexual relationships are immoral, this precept prohibiting sexual immorality prohibits same-sex relationships. However, one need only look to the doctrine of non-duality, of the genders, of the sexes, and of homosexual desire versus heterosexual desire to see that sexual orientation does not matter in the least in the Buddhist doctrinal scheme. Thus, there are many Buddhist institutions and many Buddhists out there who are very pro-LGBTQ+. It is important to note that there is no explicit doctrine prohibiting same-sex relationships like there are such doctrines in Judeo-Christian religions. Additionally, as we discussed in our episode on gender in Buddhism, the gender binary and the gender roles we experience and live with now do not necessarily carry over to different cultures or different times. So gender in Buddhism must be understood differently than we typically understand it here and now in the West in 2024. A quick side note, and swerving into a field where I'm very much not an expert, it's often said in the West that Buddhism handles the issues of queer sexuality much better than Christianity, and rightly so. But it turns out that that difference might be the result of an inaccurate translation of the Christian Bible. I've recently heard a theory from a scholar of early Christianity that the Bible verse that everybody cites as prohibiting homosexuality is actually a really bad mistranslation. I may be one of the last people to hear about this because I don't really usually associate with many Christians and even fewer scholars of Christianity, but it's a fascinating idea. The verse I'm talking about is Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22, and it says something like, "Thou shalt not lie with a man as with woman. It is abomination." Many Christians look to this verse when they say that the Bible is against homosexuality. The scholar I spoke to said that there is a theory that in the original language, either Hebrew or Aramaic, I don't know which it is, but it did not have different words that suggested the ages of people of different sexes. For example, in English we say boy to mean a child male and man to mean an adult male. Apparently, the original language more or less just referred to all male individuals of all ages with one word. This word was mistranslated as man, or adult male, for some reason. Instead, this scholar posits that, taking into account context clues, the rest of the chapter, and ancient Judean society, the word that got translated into man was supposed to refer to children, and that this prohibition was actually against pedophilia and not against homosexuality. I have literally none of the expertise necessary to evaluate this claim, so take it as you will. This scholar obviously recognizes that clearly Christian churches are mostly going with queerphobic positions and that the Catholic Church contains pedophiles and people protecting pedophiles, but it is an interesting anecdote on this topic of sex in religion nonetheless.
I've heard that theory before, a long time ago, and that theory, along with the fact that there's a whole lot of insane stuff in Leviticus in general, is part of why I'm willing to go along with any Christians who are talking about being queer inclusive. That is an improvement to the religion that I'm not sure how accurate this theory is. Like, it may be exactly what it sounds like in the Bible as understood now, but for the folks who want to make a queer inclusive Christianity, this is enough for me to give those folks the benefit of a doubt of, like, they mean this. Like, there is room for queer folks within Christianity thanks to this potential mistranslation.
I agree completely, and it's not out of the realm of any religious context to pick and choose which doctrines you follow and which ones you ignore, and it's also not entirely out of the context of Christianity or other religions to be selective about texts as well. For example, I agree that Leviticus has a lot of other crazy stuff in it that I've heard about, and if Christians want to move forward to a more progressive and inclusive situation by simply just cutting it out, as other books of the Bible have been cut out in the past, I say go for it.
Yeah, that's a valid move, and it's a move that Buddhism has also done. So
absolutely.
Of course that's permitted. We've been talking about Buddhists doing that here.
Exactly. LGBTQ issues are very complex in Asia and other non-Western countries because queerphobia is very present and even more intense than in the West. This ranges from a lack of legal recognition for gay marriage, all the way to criminal penalties, all the way to death penalties for being caught engaging in these sorts of relationships. The complicated part, however, is that this queerphobia has nothing to do with the influence of Buddhism on society. While it is the case that homophobia and queerphobia in Western cultures is due to the influence of Judeo-Christian religions on society, it is not the case that queerphobia and homophobia in East Asia and other non-Western countries originates due to the influence of Buddhism on society.
So, while we were recording this, I thought of one other question that might be good for the episode. If you are not prepared to answer this, I will just cut this out. But
okay.
So, going through just looking at Buddhist art, every once in a while, I will find something that has very explicit sexual imagery going on in it. I've seen multiple images where bodhisattvas are in the middle of sex with another figure within the art. Is there more we can learn about from Buddhism from that? Or is that a matter of local cultures being imposed onto Buddhist iconography?
That's a really good question, and I'm actually glad that you brought that up, because iconography is sort of a whole other side to this that needs to be included in the discussion. So to start with, as maybe a warning or a disclaimer or a word of caution to the listeners, when you're going out there and you're seeing images that seem to be bodhisattvas engaged in various sexual acts or seem to be mythical creatures engaged in various sexual acts, be careful because you might be looking at Hindu imagery.
Right.
For example, very few people in the West actually realize that the Kama Sutra is not in the Buddhist canon, even though it's called a sutra. This is not a text that is given by Shakyamuni Buddha, the one that we know and are familiar with. This is a Hindu text. And additionally, people also imagine that it's basically like a manual of all the different sexual positions and all the different stuff you can do during sex. It's not that either. It's actually a prescription of how to have healthy relationships that include sex in them, and how to follow a precept that is mirrored in Hinduism avoiding sexual misconduct and indiscretion. So if you're seeing these images, they might be related to that text. However, that's not to say that there are no sexual images or icons in Buddhism. There absolutely are. There absolutely are images of bodhisattvas, Buddhas, mythical creatures, all engaged in various sex acts. And what this comes down to primarily is a little bit of what we were discussing in the context of the Vimalakirti Sutra. This is a case where a bodhisattva or a mythical creature is engaged in sex as part of the path of enlightenment. They're making use of something that is potentially unwholesome, but also potentially educational as a teaching tool. This is a matter of making use of skillful means. This is something that you see especially in esoteric Buddhism. In esoteric Buddhism, there's an overarching sense of urgency. The sense of urgency is related to the fact that they believe that the early stuff, the Theravada stuff, takes too long. They believe that 3 Mahakalpas, which is the common metaphorical image or number that is given by the Buddha between now and reaching enlightenment, is too long. They think that suffering matters too much and is too much of an everyday presence in our lives, and so all of what they are up to has to do with expediting Buddhism. It has to do with speeding up the enlightenment process, speeding up the process of realizing one's own Buddhahood. There's a concept in esoteric Buddhism in Japanese that translates to Buddhahood in this very body, in this very lifetime. In Japanese, it's called Sokushin Jobutsu. And the reason that exists is, like I said, because suffering takes too long and sucks too much. And so they make use of every single possible thing in order to facilitate enlightenment. That could be sexual stuff, that could be music, that could be food, that could be sensory pleasure or sensory pain. There's this idea to make use of every single tool available in your arsenal as a bodhisattva to help expedite Buddhahood in people around you. And so that includes skillfully using sex. And skillfully meaning making sure that you're not ensnaring somebody in desire and dukkha, but making sure that they are still learning and that they're still advancing on the path and that they're still gaining some knowledge of the Dharma. Because we've talked about the label of Dharma kind of goes away, and because all reality is sort of a teaching tool or the act of teaching or the process of teaching, then engaging in sexual activity can be part of that.
All right, I think that wraps up this episode. We hope you enjoyed this week's episode on sex and Buddhism. Join us next week, where we will be discussing the stereotype of Buddhism as world rejecting. Do Buddhists reject the world? Do Buddhists believe that life is nothing but suffering? Are Buddhists fatalists or nihilists? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Hi, Nick here. I just wanted to give a big thanks to Tanner, our first patron on Patreon. Just a reminder, if you would like to join him, you can find us at patreon.com/brightonbuddhism, all one word. Thank you very much for backing us, and we hope you enjoy the show. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, producer, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like for us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, a review, or subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com, or find us on Patreon at patreon.com/brightonbuddhism. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.